The 22nd of June 1941. The dawn did not break so much as it shattered, torn open by artillery flashes that rolled across the riverbanks like summer lightning. Obergefreiter Karl Weiss lay flat in the damp grass, his fingers pressed into the soil, the smell of oil and crushed weeds mixing with cordite as the guns behind him thundered without pause. Somewhere to his left, an engine coughed to life. The low growl of a panzer, idling impatiently as if eager to cross the narrow ribbon of water ahead. Weiss had been awake for hours, like every man in his platoon, waiting for the order they all believed would change the war in a matter of weeks. The order came at 3:15. The Soviet frontier posts ahead were already burning, their wooden watchtowers collapsing in sparks and flame. Weiss pushed himself up and ran, boots splashing through reeds and mud as engineers threw down pontoon bridges under fire that seemed, to his astonishment, scattered and weak. This was supposed to be the final campaign, the one that would end everything. France had fallen in 6 weeks, Poland in less. Russia, the generals said, would be no different. Behind the lines, in field headquarters spread across East Prussia and occupied Poland, German commanders followed the opening hours of Operation Barbarossa with grim satisfaction. Reports flowed in, breathless and triumphant. Soviet aircraft destroyed on the ground, border units overrun, entire divisions caught asleep. Colonel General Heinz Guderian's panzers of Army Group Center surged forward with textbook precision, punching deep through the frontier defenses. The Red Army, long dismissed as clumsy and leaderless after Stalin's purges, appeared to be exactly what German intelligence had promised: numerous, poorly led, and fatally unprepared. Far from the front, Adolf Hitler listened to these early dispatches with vindication. For months he had insisted that the Soviet Union was a colossus with feet of clay, that a single hard kick would bring the whole rotten structure crashing down. In the Wolfschanze, his forest headquarters in East Prussia, maps were already marked with optimistic arrows stretching hundreds of kilometers eastward. Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, names that seemed less like objectives and more like formalities. The campaign was not merely a military operation. It was an ideological crusade, a war of annihilation against what the regime called Judeo-Bolshevism. Speed, shock, and relentless advance were the keys. There would be no pause. On the Soviet side of the border, confusion reigned. Lieutenant Ivan Petrov, commanding a rifle platoon near Brest-Litovsk, woke to explosions that threw him against the wall of his barracks. Windows burst inward, glass shredding bunks and bodies alike. Orders, when they came at all, were contradictory or impossible. Hold at all costs. Counterattack immediately. Retreat forbidden. Communications lines were severed within minutes. Petrov rallied what men he could, many still pulling on boots as they ran, and led them into a maelstrom of fire where German infantry advanced with terrifying coordination. By midday, Brest Fortress was surrounded, yet its defenders fought on in cellars and casemates, unaware that they had already been written off by both sides. As the days stretched into weeks, the scale of the German advance defied comprehension. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed at Białystok and Minsk. Columns of prisoners, dusty and hollow-eyed, trudged west under guard, their numbers so vast that German units struggled to feed or house them. Luftwaffe pilots boasted of easy kills, of Soviet fighters that fell from the sky like wounded birds. Newspapers in Berlin ran headlines announcing the imminent collapse of the enemy. German generals spoke openly of ending the campaign before winter, of parading through Red Square before the year was out. Yet beneath the surface of victory, roads dissolved into dust under endless traffic, then into mud after sudden summer storms. Soviet units that escaped encirclement did not dissolve as expected. They withdrew, regrouped, and returned to fight again. New formations appeared where none were thought to exist, drawn from the depths of a country the Germans barely understood. Still, confidence ruled the day. In late July, as German forces pushed toward Smolensk, senior officers reassured themselves that the Red Army was bleeding to death. Losses on the Soviet side were staggering. Entire pre-war formations erased from the order of battle. Intelligence estimates concluded that the enemy had only weeks, perhaps days, before total collapse. The Wehrmacht pressed on, its soldiers exhausted but convinced that endurance now would spare them hardship later. For men like Karl Weiss, the war had become a blur of marching, fighting, and brief, uneasy rests in captured villages. He noticed the change in the enemy's resistance, the sudden artillery barrages that fell without warning, the stubborn defenses around nameless rivers and forests but dismissed them as the last reflexes of a beaten foe. Everyone did. Orders were to keep moving, to give the Soviets no time to recover. The idea that they might already be recovering was unthinkable. By August, the road to Moscow seemed open in theory, if not yet in practice. Maps were redrawn, objectives reassigned, and debates flared among the German high command about priorities. But the central assumption remained unchallenged. The Red Army was finished, and the Soviet state was on the brink of collapse. End quote. It was an assumption born in the thunder of June's opening guns, hardened by weeks of apparent triumph. And it would guide German decisions deep into the autumn, even as reality began, slowly and inexorably, to turn against them. The 16th of July, 1941. The air shimmered with heat as Oberleutnant Franz Keller wiped sweat and dust from his eyes, peering through binoculars at the city ahead. Smolensk lay along the Dnieper like a wounded animal, its church domes darkened by smoke, its ancient walls scarred by shell fire. German artillery boomed steadily behind him, the rhythm almost comforting, but Keller felt a tension he could not quite name. This battle was taking longer than it should have. The Red Army, supposedly shattered weeks ago, was still here, and it was fighting back. The advance toward Smolensk had begun with confidence bordering on arrogance. Army Group Center's panzer spearheads had ripped open gaps in the Soviet lines, racing east in clouds of dust, bypassing pockets of resistance to be mopped up by following infantry. At first, it seemed another encirclement was unfolding, another colossal victory to add to the growing list. But as German units closed in, the Soviets counterattacked with a ferocity that surprised even seasoned veterans. Tank brigades appeared suddenly from forests and ravines, charging headlong into German columns. Losses mounted, vehicles burned by the roadside, black smoke rising straight into the blue summer sky. In the city itself, Red Army soldiers and hastily organized militia fought street by street. Sergeant Nikolai Sidorov, a reservist called up barely 10 days earlier, crouched behind a shattered brick wall, rifle trembling in his hands as German machine gun fire stitched the pavement ahead. The order was simple: hold as long as possible. Retreat was forbidden. Commissars moved among the men, urging them forward, reminding them of their duty to the motherland. Sidorov had no illusions about survival. He fought because there was nowhere else to go. German generals watched the unfolding battle with growing unease. The encirclement at Smolensk did close, trapping hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops, but the cost was higher than expected, and the victory less clean. Soviet formations fought their way out of the pocket in significant numbers, slipping east under cover of darkness or smashing through thinly held lines. For the first time, the Red Army demonstrated an ability to absorb catastrophe and continue functioning. It was not collapsing, it was bending. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group Center, urged speed. Every day spent grinding down resistance around Smolensk was a day lost on the road to Moscow. Fuel stocks dwindled. Panzer crews slept beside their vehicles, hands blistered from constant maintenance. Infantry units lagged behind, worn down by heat, dust, and the endless march. Still, Berlin demanded results. Hitler expected decisive victories, not explanations. As July turned into August, the German high command faced a dilemma. The road to Moscow beckoned, but Soviet forces remained active on the flanks, particularly in the north and south. Reports spoke of strong Red Army concentrations near Kiev and Leningrad. Moscow, he argued, was not the true objective. The destruction of Soviet armies was. Orders were issued to divert panzer forces away from the central axis, sending them north toward Leningrad and south toward Ukraine. The decision sent shockwaves through the command structure. Guderian protested bitterly, warning that delaying the drive on Moscow would give the Soviets time to recover. His objections were overruled. The panzers turned south, rolling toward Kyiv in one of the largest maneuvers of the war. The result was another massive encirclement, another staggering Soviet loss. Yet time slipped away, with every kilometer driven off the direct route to the capital. On the Soviet side, these weeks were a blur of retreat, reorganization, and brutal discipline. In Moscow, Stalin grappled with the scale of the disaster. Entire fronts had been destroyed. The Red Army had lost millions of men, killed, wounded, or captured. Yet the state did not collapse. Factories were dismantled and shipped east beyond the Urals, their machinery loaded onto trains under bombardment. New armies were formed from reservists, students, workers, anyone who could hold a rifle. Commanders learned, painfully, from defeat. Survivors carried hard-earned lessons back into the ranks. Lieutenant General Georgy Zhukov emerged as one of the few Soviet leaders capable of restoring order amid chaos. Blunt, relentless, and ruthless, he imposed discipline where panic threatened to take hold. Defensive lines were drawn, abandoned, and redrawn again, always trading space for time. The Germans advanced, but the Soviets refused to disappear. By late August, the weather began to change. Sudden rains turned roads into quagmires, vehicles sinking axle-deep in mud. The famed German logistics system strained under the weight of distance and constant movement. Horses died by the thousands. Ammunition deliveries faltered. Soldiers improvised repairs with wire and scrap metal. Confidence remained, but it was no longer effortless. In Berlin, propaganda continued to proclaim inevitable victory, was on the verge of annihilation. But among frontline officers like Keller, a different understanding was forming. The enemy was learning. Each battle seemed harder than the last. Soviet artillery grew more accurate, counterattacks more coordinated. Prisoners spoke not of surrender, but of regrouping farther east, of new units waiting beyond the horizon. As September approached, the German advance paused, not by choice, but by necessity. Men and machines needed rest. Lines needed consolidation. The illusion of a swift campaign had not yet fully shattered, but it was cracking. Once expected to be just another stepping stone on the road to Moscow, had become something else entirely, a warning that the war in the East would not end quickly, and that the Red Army, written off in the thunder of June, was far from finished. The 12th of September, 1941. West of Kyiv, Ukrainian SSR. Dust hung in the air like a permanent fog as Hauptmann Erich Sommer stood atop his half-track, scanning the distant tree line through narrowed eyes. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning steel and skin alike into burning surfaces. Somewhere ahead, beyond the rolling fields of sunflowers and harvested wheat, Soviet forces were trapped in what German officers were already calling a victory without equal. The encirclement of Kiev was tightening, its jaws closing with methodical precision. Yet Sommer felt no elation, only fatigue, and an unspoken question about how much this triumph was costing them. The drive south had been relentless. Guderian's panzer groups, diverted from the central axis, surged through Ukraine in sweeping arcs, cutting supply lines and sealing off escape routes. When the trap finally snapped shut, nearly the entire Soviet southwestern front was caught inside. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers were surrounded, their fate sealed by air superiority, artillery, and the sheer speed of German maneuver. It was, on paper, a masterpiece of operational warfare. Inside the pocket, chaos reigned. Colonel Mikhail Bondarenko, commanding a Soviet rifle regiment reduced to a few hundred men, moved through a column of exhausted soldiers stumbling eastward at night. They had no clear orders, no maps worth trusting, and little ammunition. German flares lit the sky intermittently, casting ghostly shadows across fields littered with abandoned equipment. Bondarenko knew the situation was hopeless, but surrender was unthinkable. He pushed on, hoping to slip through gaps that no longer existed. When the final Soviet resistance collapsed, the numbers stunned even the victors. Over 600,000 prisoners were taken. Roads clogged with captives stretched for kilometers, guarded by units barely able to spare the men. German soldiers stared in disbelief at the scale of the defeat they had inflicted. Newspapers hailed it as proof that the Red Army was finished at last. Hitler was ecstatic. To him, Kiev validated his decision to divert the panzers. The Soviet Union, he believed, was bleeding out. But while German forces celebrated, time continued its quiet advance. September slipped toward October. The roads east of Smolensk remained unconquered. Moscow still stood, far beyond reach. Vehicles that should have been racing toward the Soviet capital were worn down by weeks of hard fighting in Ukraine. Engines needed overhaul. Crews needed rest. Supplies had to be hauled hundreds of kilometers along fragile lines of communication. On the Soviet side, the catastrophe at Kiev was devastating but not decisive. The loss of men and materiel was immense, yet the Red Army continued to form new units. In Moscow, the mood was grim but resolute. Stalin, shaken by the scale of the defeats, nonetheless refused to abandon the capital. Defensive preparations intensified. Trenches were dug in concentric rings around the city. Anti-tank ditches scarred the countryside. Civilians, including women and teenagers, worked day and night with shovels and picks, turning farmland into fortifications. Factories in the capital worked under blackout conditions, producing rifles, machine guns, and artillery shells even as Luftwaffe bombers probed the city's defenses. At night, searchlights crisscrossed the sky, illuminating clouds and aircraft alike. Moscow did not sleep. It waited. By late September, German forces finally reoriented toward their original objective. Operation Typhoon, the final drive on Moscow, was set in motion. The plan was ambitious, even desperate. A double envelopment designed to encircle Soviet forces west of the capital and clear the path for a rapid advance. Despite exhaustion and mounting losses, morale rose. This, the soldiers believed, would end the campaign. On October 2, the offensive began. Panzers roared forward once more, tearing through thin Soviet lines. Initial successes were dramatic. Vast encirclements formed at Vyazma and Bryansk, trapping more Soviet armies. Once again, the Red Army suffered catastrophic losses. Once again, German commanders declared victory imminent. Moscow was less than 300 kilometers away, but the weather, long ignored in planning, now intervened. Autumn rains turned dirt roads into seas of mud. Vehicles bogged down, immobilized for hours or days. Horses collapsed, unable to pull overloaded wagons through the sucking mire. Soviet resistance stiffened as the Germans struggled forward. Units that had escaped encirclement regrouped and counterattacked vulnerable spearheads. Artillery fire grew heavier. Snipers appeared in forests and villages, exacting a steady toll. German infantry, advancing without adequate winter clothing or shelter, began to feel the strain of a campaign that refused to end. In Moscow, the sound of distant artillery could now be heard on clear days. Panic flickered briefly. Some government offices evacuated east, archives packed into crates. But Stalin stayed. His decision to remain in the city, announced quietly but firmly, had a powerful effect. If the leader stayed, the capital would stand. For men like Erich Sommer, the sense of inevitability that had defined the summer was gone. Each kilometer eastward demanded more effort than the last. Victory was still spoken of, still promised, but it felt heavier now, less certain. The Red Army, battered and bloodied, continued to rise from its defeats, trading lives for time, space for survival. As October deepened and the mud clung stubbornly to wheels and boots, the German army found itself fighting not only a determined enemy, but the consequences of its own choices. Kiev had been a triumph beyond measure, yet it had cost something far more precious than men or machines. It had cost time and time. In the vastness of Russia, was an enemy no general could encircle. The 7th of October, 1941. Near Vyazma, Western Russia. The rain had stopped, but the earth still swallowed men whole. Gefreiter Otto Brandt leaned his weight into the rear of a stalled truck, boots slick with mud as the engine whined uselessly. Every shove sent the vehicle rocking but not moving, its wheels buried to the hubs in thick gray sludge. Around him, other soldiers strained and cursed, their uniforms soaked, faces gaunt with exhaustion. Somewhere ahead, artillery thundered dully, the sound muffled by low clouds. Operation Typhoon was supposed to be a final sprint. Instead, it had become a crawl through filth and fatigue. The opening days of the offensive had rekindled German confidence. On October 2, panzer groups surged forward under clear skies, smashing through Soviet lines weakened by earlier defeats. The plan unfolded with brutal efficiency. 2 massive encirclements formed near Vyazma and Bryansk, trapping hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers. Luftwaffe bombers struck relentlessly, turning roads into killing grounds and forests into graveyards. German officers spoke again of decisive victory. Moscow, they said, was within reach at last. Inside the Vyazma pocket, the situation was desperate. Major Sergei Karpov, commanding a shattered Soviet division, gathered his remaining officers in a shallow trench. As German artillery walked closer with every passing hour, maps were useless. Units had disintegrated. Communications vanished. Orders from higher command were fragmentary or non-existent. Yet Karpov refused to surrender. He ordered small groups to break out at night, slipping through forests and marshes, trading cohesion for survival. Thousands died or were captured, but tens of thousands escaped, melting eastward to fight again. German commanders underestimated the significance of these escapes. They counted prisoners and destroyed units, not the men who slipped away with rifles and bitter resolve. Every Soviet soldier who escaped the encirclement carried with him time that Moscow desperately needed. Meanwhile, German formations pushed forward, thinning their own ranks as infantry struggled to keep pace with armor. Supply columns lagged far behind, hampered by the same mud that plagued the frontline units. By mid-October, the weather worsened. Cold rain alternated with sleet, turning the ground into an unbroken quagmire, known to Russians as Rasputitsa. Roads ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. Panzers, designed for speed and maneuver, wallowed helplessly. Recovery vehicles broke down trying to tow them free. Fuel consumption skyrocketed as engines ran constantly just to stay warm and functional. Men slept in damp foxholes, wrapped in thin coats that offered little protection against the cold creeping in from the ground. Soviet resistance, far from collapsing, hardened. Newly formed units were rushed to the front with minimal training, thrown into the line to slow the German advance at any cost. Colonel General Georgy Zhukov, now tasked with organizing the defense of Moscow, imposed a ruthless clarity of purpose. There would be no further uncontrolled retreats. Positions were to be held, counterattacks launched whenever possible, and the enemy bled white in front of the capital. One such stand unfolded along the Mochaisk defense line, a series of hastily prepared fortifications west of Moscow. Lieutenant Anna Morozova, serving as a medical officer, worked non-stop in a makeshift aid station carved into the side of a hill. Wounded men streamed in, covered in mud and blood, some barely older than boys. German artillery shook the earth above them. Dirt raining down from the ceiling, Morozova barely noticed. She stitched, bandaged, and reassured, her voice steady even as the situation outside deteriorated. For German soldiers like Brandt, the sense of momentum was slipping away. Marches that should have taken hours stretched into days. Rations ran low. Ammunition deliveries were erratic. Frost began to appear on vehicle hulls in the early mornings, a thin white warning of what was to come. Yet orders from above remained unchanged. Advance, advance, advance. Moscow was the prize, and the enemy was supposedly on his last legs. High command debates grew more heated. Field Marshal von Bock pressed for renewed effort, arguing that a final push could still take the city before winter set in fully. Others warned that the army was nearing the limits of its endurance. Winter clothing had not been issued. The campaign, after all, was never meant to last this long. Hitler dismissed such concerns, convinced that the Soviet Union was already defeated in everything but name. In the Kremlin, the stakes were unmistakable. Stalin addressed the Moscow Soviet on November 6, his voice broadcast across the city as German guns echoed in the distance. He spoke of sacrifice, of history, of the invaders' inevitable defeat. The speech was defiant, almost theatrical, but it served its purpose. Morale stiffened. The city prepared for siege, its people determined to endure whatever came. As October drew to a close, the German advance slowed to a near halt. The encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk had been vast victories, but they had not broken Soviet resistance. Instead, they had bought the Red Army precious weeks. New divisions arrived from the east, some composed of Siberian troops hardened by years in extreme cold. They came equipped with winter clothing, skis, and a quiet confidence born of preparation. For Otto Brandt, the realization came gradually, in the aching joints and numb fingers that no amount of movement could warm. The enemy ahead was still there. The road behind was impassable, and the promise of an easy war, forged in the bright optimism of June, felt like a distant memory. Operation Typhoon continued on paper, but in the mud west of Moscow, its momentum was bleeding away, hour by hour, into the frozen ground. The 15th of November, 1941. Klin, northwest of Moscow. The snow came suddenly, swirling out of a steel-gray sky and settling on men and machines alike. Lieutenant Wilhelm Hartmann stamped his feet beside a road choked with frozen ruts, his breath forming white clouds that vanished almost instantly in the biting air. Ahead of him, the silhouettes of half-frozen panzers loomed like abandoned relics, engines coughing weakly as crews struggled to coax life from metal stiffened by cold. Somewhere beyond the trees lay Moscow, closer than it had ever been. Yet the city felt impossibly distant. After weeks of mud and stagnation, the ground had finally hardened. The Rasputitsa loosened its grip, and German commanders seized the moment. Operation Typhoon was renewed with desperate urgency. Fresh offensives pushed north toward Klin and south toward Tula, aiming to encircle Moscow from both flanks. For a brief, terrifying moment, it seemed the gamble might succeed. Soviet defenses bent under renewed pressure. German patrols reported church spires visible on the horizon, the outer suburbs of the capital almost within artillery range. In Klin, fighting was savage and close. Soviet units, many newly arrived and understrength, clung to the town with grim determination. Captain Alexei Voronin led a company of riflemen through snow-filled streets, the crack of rifles and the bark of machine guns echoing off wooden houses. Orders were clear: delay the enemy at any cost. Voronin watched his men fall, one by one, and kept moving forward, driven by the knowledge that behind him lay the heart of the Soviet Union. The cold was merciless. Temperatures plunged well below freezing at night, turning weapons into liabilities. German machine guns jammed as lubricants thickened. Tank engines seized without warning. Soldiers wrapped rags around their feet, stuffed newspapers inside boots, and slept huddled together for warmth. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and ears with silent efficiency. Medical stations overflowed with men whose wounds were inflicted not by bullets, but by the climate itself. Soviet forces, by contrast, seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Reinforcements from Siberia and the Far East arrived in disciplined columns, their arrival concealed for weeks by careful deception. Intelligence reports, some accurate and some dangerously optimistic, had convinced Stalin that Japan would not attack in the east. The troops released from that front were well-trained, well-equipped, and accustomed to winter warfare. Their presence transformed the defense of Moscow. General Zhukov deployed these fresh divisions with calculated precision. They bolstered weak sectors, launched sharp counterattacks, and restored confidence to exhausted units. Camouflaged in white, Soviet ski troops glided through forests and across frozen fields, striking German outposts at night and disappearing before dawn. For the first time, the invader found himself hunted. In the south, near Tula, German attempts to encircle the city faltered under stubborn resistance. Workers from armaments factories fought alongside regular troops, defending their homes with rifles and Molotov cocktails. The city held, anchoring the southern flank of Moscow's defenses and denying the Germans a critical victory. Within Moscow itself, life continued under the shadow of encirclement. Civilians slept in metro stations turned into bomb shelters. Children curled beside parents as trains rattled past. Yet the city did not descend into panic. Factories maintained production. Soldiers marched through Red Square in a November 7 parade commemorating the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, then marched directly from the square to the front. The symbolism was unmistakable. For German soldiers like Hartmann, the situation was growing increasingly bleak. Supplies of winter clothing remained woefully inadequate. Letters from home spoke of mild autumns and expectations of imminent victory, a bitter contrast to the reality of frozen trenches and unending combat. Orders continued to press them forward, but the energy was gone. Attacks gained ground measured in meters, not kilometers, and were often reversed by Soviet counterblows. By early December, the German advance had reached its absolute limit. Forward elements came within sight of the Kremlin's spires, but no closer. The line stretched thin, its flanks exposed, its men exhausted beyond endurance. The temperature dropped further, plunging to levels unseen by most of the German army. What had been an offensive now felt like a siege conducted by an army unprepared for the conditions it faced. The belief that the Red Army was finished lingered in some quarters, but on the ground, it rang hollow. The enemy was still there, entrenched, reinforced, and increasingly confident. Moscow, battered but unbroken, stood defiant in the snow. As Wilhelm Hartmann pulled his coat tighter against the cold and stared east into the white void, he sensed that something fundamental had changed. The war that was supposed to end in triumph before winter had become a fight for survival. And the city ahead was no longer just an objective on a map. It was a wall, and the German army was about to discover how hard it could be. The 5th of December, 1941. Near Istra River, west of Moscow, the cold arrived like an unseen enemy in the night. Unteroffizier Heinrich Vogel woke to a sound he had never heard before, the sharp crack of metal splitting under stress. Nearby, a truck axle snapped as if struck by a hammer. The temperature had plunged far below zero, turning breath into ice and exposed skin into agony within minutes. Vogel pulled himself upright in his foxhole, fingers stiff and numb, and realized with a jolt of fear that this cold was different. This cold killed without firing a shot. German positions west of Moscow were stretched thin, a ragged line of exhausted men clinging to frozen ground. Weapons failed with alarming regularity. Rifle bolts froze solid. Artillery recoil mechanisms jammed. Even the oil in engine crankcases congealed into useless sludge. Abandoned furniture to keep from freezing to death. Winter clothing, promised months earlier, was still scarce. Summer uniforms, layered with whatever rags could be scavenged, offered little protection against the brutal Russian winter. Across the lines, the Red Army prepared in silence. For weeks, Zhukov and the Stavka had planned a counterstroke, waiting for the precise moment when the German offensive would exhaust itself completely. That moment had come. Soviet troops, many clad in padded winter coats and white camouflage, assembled under cover of darkness. Artillery was brought forward on sledges. Ski battalions moved effortlessly through forests the Germans could barely penetrate on foot. At dawn, the silence shattered. Soviet guns opened fire along a wide front, their shells ripping into frozen German positions. Vogel felt the ground convulse beneath him as explosions threw up geysers of ice and earth. Orders came too late. or not at all. The attack was everywhere at once, north, center, and south, slamming into units that had neither reserves nor mobility left. Captain Sergei Mikhailov led his Siberian Rifle Battalion forward through knee-deep snow, breath steady, movements precise. His men advanced in disciplined waves, skis whispering across the frozen surface. German machine gun fire rattled briefly, then faltered as weapons jammed or crews fled. Mikhailov saw enemy soldiers emerging from trenches, hands raised, faces gray with cold and shock. Others ran, slipping and falling, chased by Soviet infantry who had trained for this very environment. The German high command was stunned. Hitler, informed of the counteroffensive, reacted with fury and disbelief. He issued an immediate order forbidding retreat, insisting that positions be held at all costs. To yield ground, he believed, would invite total collapse. Field commanders protested, warning that rigid defense would lead to encirclement and destruction. Their objections were dismissed. The army was to stand fast. On the ground, the consequences were catastrophic. Units already on the brink were crushed by relentless Soviet pressure. Frozen roads prevented organized withdrawals. Trucks abandoned for lack of fuel became landmarks in a landscape of defeat. Frostbite cases soared, often untreated as medical services collapsed under the strain. Men who fell asleep without adequate shelter sometimes never woke. Near the town of Klin, Heinrich Vogel's platoon received the order to hold their position despite mounting losses. Soviet infantry closed in, supported by T-34 tanks whose wide tracks handled snow with ease. German anti-tank guns, poorly sighted and immobile, were overrun. Vogel fired until his rifle jammed, then reached for a grenade with hands that barely obeyed him. When the order finally came to pull back, it was already too late. The line had dissolved. Soviet advances gathered speed. Town after town was liberated in rapid succession. Klin, Kalinin, and dozens of smaller settlements reclaimed from an enemy too exhausted to resist effectively. Civilians emerged from cellars to greet Red Army troops with tears and bread. Some, weeping openly at the sight of German units retreating westward. For the first time since June, the war had reversed direction. At headquarters, German officers struggled to impose order on chaos. Maps became obsolete within hours as front lines shifted unpredictably. Entire regiments vanished, swallowed by snow and combat. The myth of invincibility that had carried the Wehrmacht across Europe lay shattered in the frozen fields outside Moscow. Yet the retreat was not an organized withdrawal. It was a series of desperate, fragmented movements to escape encirclement. Some units fought their way back with discipline and courage. Others disintegrated under pressure. Soviet cavalry exploited gaps, striking supply columns and command posts deep behind the front. Panic spread, though rarely spoken aloud. In Moscow, the mood transformed almost overnight. The distant thunder of battle moved steadily westward. Air raid sirens sounded less frequently. Stalin received reports of liberated towns with cautious satisfaction. He understood the significance of what was happening. It was the first time the German army had been decisively halted and driven back on land. For the soldiers of the Red Army, the counter-offensive carried a sense of vindication. They had endured catastrophe after catastrophe, encirclement, retreat, unimaginable loss, and yet they stood here now, advancing. The belief that the Germans were unbeatable dissolved with every kilometer reclaimed. By late December, the German front west of Moscow had been pushed back between 100 and 250 kilometers. The immediate threat to the capital was over. The cost had been enormous on both sides, but the strategic meaning was unmistakable. Operation Barbarossa had failed to achieve its primary objective. The Soviet Union had not collapsed. The war would continue. As Heinrich Vogel stumbled west with the remnants of his unit, face wrapped in a frozen scarf, he no longer thought of victory. He thought only of survival, of warmth, of getting through the night. The war that was supposed to be short and glorious had turned into something else entirely. In the snowbound forests and shattered villages beyond Moscow, Germany suffered its first great defeat on land. and the world began to understand that the Red Army, once dismissed and derided, had refused to fall. The 10th of January 1942. Snow drifted endlessly across the frozen plain, driven by a wind that cut through wool and skin alike. Lieutenant Ernst Keller crouched in a shallow trench, his breath rasping loudly in his ears as he peered through frost-caked binoculars. The landscape before him was unrecognizable, a white expanse broken by blackened tree stumps and the twisted wreckage of vehicles half buried in ice. This was no longer an advance. It was a desperate holding action, and every man on the line knew it. The Soviet winter counteroffensive did not end with the relief of Moscow. It surged outward, pushing German forces back along a broad front. The retreat westward had stabilized only with great difficulty, creating a bulge in the German lines known as the Reserve salient. Here, both sides hurled men and machines into a grinding struggle that would come to be called the Reserve meat grinder. The fighting was relentless, brutal, and often senseless, driven by orders that demanded ground be held or taken regardless of cost. For the German army, the psychological impact of the winter defeats was profound. The belief in inevitable victory, nurtured by years of success, had been shattered in the snows outside Moscow. Officers who had once spoken confidently of campaigns measured in weeks now planned operations with a grim awareness of limitations. Supplies remained inadequate. Winter clothing arrived slowly and in insufficient quantities. Frostbite continued to claim casualties even as the front stabilized. Hitler's reaction hardened into rigid control. Blaming setbacks on cowardice and lack of will, he tightened his grip on operational decisions. Retreats, even tactically sound ones, were increasingly forbidden. Units were ordered to hold ground at all costs, transforming exposed positions into death traps. Some commanders obeyed reluctantly. Others paid with their careers, or their lives, for defiance. On the Soviet side, confidence grew alongside casualties. The counteroffensive had restored morale and proven that the Wehrmacht could be beaten. Yet success brought its own dangers. Soviet attacks were often launched hastily, with limited coordination and heavy losses. Infantry advanced through deep snow under machine gun fire, sometimes without adequate artillery support. The Red Army was learning, but it was still paying in blood for every lesson. Captain Dmitry Lebedev led a platoon across an open field near Ruzhev, the snow crunching underfoot as German shells burst around them. Men fell, red staining the white ground, but the survivors pressed on. Lebedev had seen too much death to believe in easy victories. Still, he sensed a shift. The Germans were no longer attacking with confidence. They were reacting, defending, enduring. Behind the front, the Soviet war machine gathered strength. Evacuated factories beyond the Urals resumed production at astonishing speed, turning out tanks, aircraft, and artillery in numbers that would soon overwhelm German capacity to respond. The T-34, once a shock on the battlefield, became a common sight. Crews trained under harsh conditions, learning to fight in coordination with infantry and artillery. The Red Army of 1942 was not the force that had reeled in 1941. For German soldiers like Keller, the days blurred into a cycle of cold, hunger, and fear. Attacks came without warning, often at dawn, when the cold was most severe. Soviet artillery pounded trenches into shapeless pits. Counterattacks reclaimed ground, only to lose it again days later. There was no sense of progress, only survival. In Berlin, propaganda struggled to explain the change in fortune. Official statements spoke of elastic defense and temporary setbacks, but letters from the front told a different story. Families sensed the truth even if they could not name it. The war in the East was not going as promised. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, framed the defense of Moscow as a turning point in history. Newspapers and radio broadcasts celebrated the courage of soldiers and civilians alike. The narrative of inevitable defeat was replaced with one of resilience and eventual triumph. Stalin, once silent and withdrawn during the darkest days, now appeared more frequently, projecting confidence and resolve. As winter dragged on, casualties mounted on both sides. The Rzhev salient consumed divisions, grinding them down in a brutal stalemate. Yet its existence underscored a larger reality. The German army had been forced onto the defensive, compelled to fight for ground it once assumed would fall without a struggle. For Ernst Keller, watching Soviet flares rise into the night sky, the realization was unavoidable. The Red Army had not only survived, it had adapted. It had absorbed unimaginable punishment and emerged capable of taking the initiative. The myth of German invincibility, carefully constructed through years of victory, lay buried beneath the snow. In the frozen wastes west of Moscow, amid endless combat and suffering, a new understanding settled over the battlefield. This war would not be decided in a single campaign or a single year. It would be long, brutal, and unforgiving. February 20, 1942. Army Group Center Headquarters, Smolensk Region. A dim bulb flickered above the map table as General Oberst Günther von Kluge studied the front lines in silence. The red and blue pins told a story no report could soften. What had once been bold arrows thrusting eastward were now jagged, uncertain lines bending backward under pressure. Outside the bunker, engines idled weakly in the cold, and the wind carried the distant thud of artillery constant, relentless. The campaign that was meant to end the war had instead opened a wound that refused to close. The winter fighting around Moscow had settled into a brutal equilibrium. German forces clung to defensive positions carved into frozen earth, while Soviet armies continued probing attacks along the front. Neither side possessed the strength for decisive breakthroughs, but the balance had shifted irrevocably. The Wehrmacht was no longer dictating events. It was reacting, improvising, enduring. For German units, the strain was cumulative. Reinforcements arrived slowly, often undertrained and poorly equipped. Vehicles damaged months earlier remained unrepaired for lack of parts. Horses, once the backbone of logistics, had been slaughtered for food or lost to exhaustion. Rations were reduced, and morale frayed under the weight of cold, casualties, and uncertainty. Veterans spoke quietly of how different this war felt from France or Poland, how the enemy here did not break, did not know when to stop. Hitler's directives grew more rigid with every setback. He blamed generals for lacking will, soldiers for lacking toughness. Orders emphasized ideological resolve over tactical flexibility. Positions were to be held regardless of cost. The result was a series of isolated strongpoints, hedgehogs, as they were called, surrounded and battered by Soviet forces. Some held, many did not. In one such position near Yuchnov, Feldwebel Otto Reimer commanded a mixed group of infantrymen and engineers, dug in around a frozen crossroads. Supplies arrived by air when weather allowed, parachutes drifting down into Soviet fire. Reimer rationed ammunition carefully, knowing relief might never come. At night, Soviet patrols crept close, their voices carrying eerily across the snow. Sleep came only in brief, uneasy fragments. On the Soviet side, success brought harsh lessons. The Red Army's winter offensive had stretched supply lines and exhausted formations. Casualties were staggering. Attacks often faltered against well-prepared German defenses, and entire units were chewed up in frontal assaults. Yet the difference from 1941 was stark. Losses no longer meant collapse. Units were withdrawn, refitted, and sent back. Commanders analyzed failures instead of hiding them. The army was learning how to fight a modern war. Political officers continued to enforce discipline, but fear was no longer the sole motivator. A sense of purpose had taken root. Soldiers believed now that survival and victory were possible. Letters home spoke not just of suffering, but of determination. The defense of Moscow had become a shared memory, a symbol of what could be achieved. Far behind the lines, Soviet industry roared to life. In snowbound cities beyond the Urals, factories worked around the clock. Women and teenagers operated lathes and presses, producing tanks and guns in unprecedented numbers. Trains carried this output westward in an unending stream. The imbalance that had defined the opening months of Barbarossa began to tilt. German intelligence noted these developments with alarm. Airfields multiplied. The assumption that Soviet manpower and industry were nearing exhaustion proved catastrophically wrong. By early spring, the front around Moscow remained unstable but intact. The immediate danger to the capital had passed, but the war was far from over. Both sides prepared for what they believed would be the decisive campaigns of 1942. Yet, for Germany, the strategic situation had fundamentally changed. The opportunity for a quick, decisive victory in the east was gone. For von Kluge and other senior commanders, the realization was sobering. They faced an enemy that had survived annihilation, adapted under pressure, and now possessed the initiative in key sectors. The Red Army, once dismissed as incompetent and brittle, had revealed a capacity for endurance that defied German expectations. As February wore on, and the first hints of thaw appeared beneath the snow, the Eastern Front settled into a grim stalemate. The illusion that had carried German forces across the Soviet border in June lay shattered. In its place stood a harsher reality. This was a war of attrition, fought across vast distances against an enemy who refused to fall. The winter outside Moscow had not merely halted the German advance, it had changed the nature of the war itself, forcing Germany to confront a truth it had long denied. The 30th of March 1942. Near Gazovsk, western Russia, the snow was beginning to rot. Oberleutnant Paul Meissner noticed it first in the smell. A damp, sour odor rising from the ground as boots broke through the crust and sank into slush. Winter was loosening its grip, but the thaw brought no relief. Mud returned with a vengeance, swallowing trenches and gun pits, clogging weapons already worn from months of abuse. Meissner watched his men struggle to reinforce a position that barely existed anymore, and understood, with a clarity that frightened him, that the army had learned too late what this war truly demanded. The spring thaw marked a pause in large-scale operations, but not in suffering. Along the front west of Moscow, both sides used the lull to reorganize, replenish, and most importantly, study the battles that had nearly decided the fate of the Soviet capital. For the Red Army, Moscow was proof that survival was possible. For the Wehrmacht, it was a warning written in frozen corpses and broken machines. German after-action reports circulated quietly through headquarters. They spoke of underestimated distances, inadequate logistics, and catastrophic failures in winter preparation. The tone was analytical, but beneath the language lay shock. The army that had crushed Poland and France had reached the limits of its operational doctrine. Blitzkrieg, dependent on speed, surprise, and short supply lines, had faltered in the vastness of Russia. When momentum died, the system collapsed into improvisation. Yet, these lessons clashed with ideology. Hitler refused to accept structural failure. He interpreted defeat in moral terms, failures of will, of resolve. As a result, many of the generals who understood what had gone wrong found themselves increasingly marginalized. Command became centralized to an unprecedented degree. Flexibility, once the hallmark of German success, was sacrificed for obedience. At the front, this translated into orders that ignored conditions on the ground. Units were told to hold exposed positions through thaw and flood. Withdrawals were delayed until they became routes. The human cost mounted quietly. Men died not only in combat, but of exhaustion, disease, and accidents born of impossible demands. For the Soviet command, the months after Moscow were a period of harsh self-examination. Victory had been won, but at an appalling price. Soviet planners studied German tactics in detail, dissecting encirclements, armored thrusts, and combined arms coordination. Captured equipment was examined and copied. Survivors of early disasters were questioned, their experiences folded into new training manuals. The Red Army's learning curve, steep and bloody, was accelerating. Lieutenant Colonel Yuri Antonov, assigned to a training brigade near Kaluga, drilled replacements drawn from factories and farms. Many had never fired a rifle before arriving. Antonov taught them differently now, emphasizing camouflage, entrenchment, coordination with artillery. He spoke bluntly of German strengths and weaknesses, of how the enemy fought and how he could be beaten. These were not the hollow slogans of 1941. They were lessons bought with lives. Morale within Soviet ranks changed in subtle but profound ways. Fear remained, but it was no longer paralyzing. Soldiers believed they could survive contact with the enemy. They had seen Germans retreat. They had captured their weapons, taken their prisoners. The psychological balance of the war had shifted. Internationally, the defense of Moscow echoed far beyond the Eastern Front. In London and Washington, military planners reassessed German power. The Wehrmacht, once considered unstoppable, had been checked. For the first time, Allied leaders spoke openly of Germany's eventual defeat as something more than a distant hope. Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union increased, its convoys braving Arctic seas to deliver trucks, food, and raw materials that would soon play a critical role. Back near Gzhatsk, Paul Meissner watched Soviet artillery test fire across the front, the thunder rolling low and steady. It sounded different from the chaotic barrages of the previous year, more deliberate, more controlled. The enemy was not merely surviving now. He was preparing. German soldiers sensed this too. Patrols encountered stronger resistance, more frequent ambushes. Soviet positions were better sighted, better concealed. The crude mass attacks of early winter were giving way to more sophisticated operations. Each encounter reinforced an uncomfortable truth. The Red Army of 1942 was not the Red Army of 1941. As April approached, both sides braced for what came next. But the assumptions that had guided the opening of Barbarossa were gone. No German general seriously believed anymore in a quick collapse of the Soviet Union. Meissner folded his map and glanced east, toward a horizon that seemed to stretch endlessly. The war had entered a new phase one, defined not by bold illusions, but by grim recognition. The failure before Moscow had rewritten the rules of the conflict, and every army on the Eastern Front would now fight under its shadow, carrying lessons learned too late and paid for in blood. The 12th of May 1942. Near the Volga headwaters, Central Russia. The forest hummed with insects and the low murmur of men at work. Major Konstantin Sokolov paused at the edge of a newly dug trench, wiping sweat from his brow as he studied the camouflage nets stretched carefully over artillery pieces. Spring had fully arrived, and with it came a deceptive calm. The snow was gone, the ground firm once more, and the Red Army was preparing not to survive, but to strike. For the first time since the war began, the initiative felt tangible. Along the central sector of the Eastern Front, both sides regrouped after the brutal winter. German forces attempted to restore coherence, rotating shattered divisions out of the line and patching together defensive belts. New recruits arrived from Germany and occupied Europe, young and inexperienced, thrown into formations led by veterans hollowed by months of attrition. Equipment shortages persisted. The Wehrmacht still possessed formidable strength, but it was no longer whole. For the Soviet Union, the months after Moscow marked a strategic awakening. The Stavka began to think not merely in terms of survival, but of shaping the future course of the war. Operations were planned, with greater coordination. Artillery concentrations were massed deliberately. Air support, once haphazard, became more integrated with ground forces. Mistakes were still made, often at great cost, but they were no longer repeated blindly. Sokolov's artillery regiment trained relentlessly. Crews practiced rapid deployment and displacement, firing short, intense barrages before moving to avoid counter-battery fire. Ammunition stocks, once critically low, were now adequate. New guns arrived from factories thousands of kilometers away, their paint still fresh, their crews eager to prove themselves. The scale of Soviet production was beginning to assert itself on the battlefield. German intelligence observed these preparations with growing concern. Reports warned of increasing Soviet strength opposite Army Group Center, of troop movements conducted with unprecedented secrecy. Yet German strategic focus had shifted south, toward the Caucasus oil fields and the Volga city of Stalingrad. The Central Front, though still vital, was no longer the main effort. This redistribution of attention created vulnerabilities the Red Army would soon exploit. At the tactical level, engagements grew sharper and more complex. Soviet reconnaissance units probed German lines aggressively, mapping defenses and identifying weak points. Night raids disrupted supply routes and command posts. The enemy was being tested, measured, and worn down deliberately. German soldiers felt the change. Gone were the months when Soviet attacks seemed reckless and disorganized. Now they came with artillery preparation, followed by infantry advancing under covering fire, supported by tanks that coordinated closely with foot soldiers. Each clash demanded full attention. Complacency was punished swiftly. For Sokolov, the war had transformed from chaos into grim purpose. He remembered the retreats of 1,941, the endless columns of wounded and broken units. Now, he watched young soldiers learning their craft, mastering guns that could shape battles. The cost had been staggering, but the result was an army fundamentally altered by experience. By early summer, the front west of Moscow stabilized into a tense balance. Neither side launched a decisive offensive there, but the strategic implications were clear. Germany could no longer afford to underestimate its enemy. The Soviet Union, battered but unbroken, had seized the chance to rebuild and adapt. As Sokolov gave the order for a final practice barrage, the guns thundered in unison, echoing through the forest. The sound carried with it a message born of hard truth. The Red Army was no longer merely reacting to events. It was shaping them. The failure to take Moscow had not ended the war, but it had turned it, setting in motion forces that would grind inexorably toward a different conclusion. The 1st of July, 1942. Forward Observation Post. Central Russian Front. The summer heat shimmered above the wheat fields as Lieutenant Viktor Kuznetsov adjusted his rangefinder, eyes fixed on a distant tree line where German positions lay hidden. Cicadas buzzed loudly, almost drowning out the rumble of engines far to the south. The war felt different now, less frantic, more deliberate. Each movement was calculated, each shell accounted for. The chaos of the previous year had given way to something colder and more methodical. This was no longer a campaign of shock. It was a contest of endurance. By mid-1942, the memory of Moscow cast a long shadow over both armies. For the Wehrmacht, it was the moment when certainty gave way to doubt. German strategy shifted decisively southward, toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the industrial artery of the Volga. Army Group Center, once the spear aimed at Moscow, was now largely on the defensive, tasked with holding ground rather than seizing it. This strategic pivot reshaped the war. German forces stripped from the Central Front were redeployed south, weakening defenses opposite Moscow. Soviet command noticed immediately. Reconnaissance confirmed thinner lines, fewer reserves, and overextended supply routes. Instead, it planned, preparing the groundwork for future operations, while maintaining pressure along the entire front. Kuznetsov's battery fired intermittently throughout the day, harassing German positions and probing for responses. Each exchange was logged, analyzed, fed into a growing body of operational knowledge. Soviet artillery doctrine evolved rapidly, emphasizing massed firepower and coordination. The lessons of 1941, when guns were often abandoned or wasted, were never far from mind. German soldiers sensed the shift as well. Defensive warfare, especially against an enemy growing stronger by the month, wore heavily on morale. Trenches baked in the sun, offering little relief from heat or insects. Supplies arrived irregularly. Luftwaffe support, once overwhelming, was now contested. Soviet fighters and ground attack aircraft appeared with increasing frequency, strafing roads and supply dumps. Within the German command structure, tensions deepened. Generals argued over priorities and resources, often behind closed doors. The failure before Moscow was rarely mentioned openly. but it informed every discussion. The realization that Germany faced a prolonged industrial war against a vast opponent unsettled even the most confident officers. For the Soviet Union, endurance became a source of strength. Mobilization reached deeper into society. Training programs expanded. Officer corps quality improved as combat experience filtered upward. The Red Army still suffered immense losses, but it replaced them with growing efficiency. Each month, its ability to conduct large-scale, coordinated operations increased. Civilians near the front adapted as well. Villages rebuilt and evacuated repeatedly. Fields planted and abandoned under shell fire. Life continued in the margins of war, shaped by resilience rather than hope. The defense of Moscow had instilled a belief that survival itself was a form of victory. By late summer, the front west of the capital remained largely static, but its significance was immense. It fixed German forces in place, preventing them from reinforcing critical battles elsewhere. The Red Army understood this and maintained constant pressure, ensuring that Army Group Center could not recover its former strength. As dusk settled over the fields, Kuznetsov lowered his rangefinder and listened to the distant echo of artillery rolling across the horizon. Somewhere far away, the war's next great battles were forming. But here, in the quiet tension of a holding front, the consequences of Moscow were still being felt. The war that began with contempt and certainty had been redefined by resistance and adaptation, and neither side could escape the reality forged in the winter of 1941, the 7th of October 1942. Rain streaked down the tall windows as Colonel Joachim Riedel stood rigidly at attention, waiting for permission to speak. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of a clock and the distant murmur of staff officers moving through corridors heavy with tension. Maps covered the walls, Eastern Europe painted in dense layers of pins and pencil marks, but one absence was impossible to ignore. There were no bold arrows pointing east anymore. The confidence that had once filled these rooms was gone, replaced by grim calculation. More than a year had passed since German forces first crossed into the Soviet Union. Once described euphemistically as a temporary setback, had become impossible to disguise. Reports from the front painted a stark picture. Enormous losses, exhausted formations, and an enemy that had grown stronger with every blow. The winter of 1941-42 was no longer just a memory. Within the German High Command, a reluctant consensus formed. Operation Barbarossa had failed in its central objective. The Red Army had not been destroyed. The Soviet state had not collapsed. Instead, Germany faced a prolonged conflict against an industrial and military power capable of absorbing losses on a scale the Reich could not match indefinitely. This was Germany's first major strategic defeat on land, even if few dared to say it aloud. The implications rippled outward. Allied nations, watching closely, adjusted their strategies. The United States, now fully at war after Pearl Harbor, poured resources into the Allied cause. Britain intensified its bombing campaign against German industry. The Soviet Union, buoyed by survival and growing confidence, demanded and received greater material support. The Axis, for the first time, fought a war in which time worked against it. On the Eastern Front, the consequences of Moscow were written into every engagement. German forces fought defensively more often than not, relying on field fortifications and elastic responses rather than sweeping offensives. Soviet operations, though still costly, showed increasing sophistication. Encirclements were planned with care. Artillery barrages were synchronized. Air support was coordinated. The Red Army no longer relied on desperation alone. For soldiers on both sides, the meaning of Moscow was deeply personal. German veterans spoke quietly of the winter, of frozen comrades left by the roadside, of orders that made no sense in the face of reality. Soviet soldiers carried the memory as proof that endurance mattered, that sacrifice had meaning beyond survival. The city had become a symbol not just of defense, but of transformation. Propaganda shifted accordingly. In Germany, triumphalist rhetoric gave way to calls for total war and sacrifice. In the Soviet Union, Moscow was enshrined as a heroic stand, a moment when history itself had been halted and turned. Medals were awarded. Stories were told and retold, shaping a national narrative of resilience. Strategists would later argue over what mattered most: the weather, logistics, leadership, or ideology. But on the ground, the truth was simpler. The Red Army had refused to break. It had adapted faster than expected, endured losses beyond imagination, and used time as a weapon. Germany, confident in speed and shock, had found itself trapped by distance and delay. Colonel Riedel was finally dismissed, his report absorbed into a mountain of grim documentation. Berlin still stood unbombed and confident in appearance. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. The war that began with dismissal and disdain had reached a point of no return, and the road to that realization led back, inevitably, to the frozen fields outside Moscow. The 31st of December 1942. Red Square, Moscow. Snow drifted gently beneath a darkened sky as Sergeant Alexei Morozov stood at the edge of the square, rifle slung over his shoulder, boots planted firmly on stones that had once seemed destined to echo under enemy footsteps. Church bells rang softly in the distance, marking the end of a year that had nearly destroyed everything he knew and yet had failed. 1 year earlier, German generals had been certain they were standing on the threshold of history. Moscow, they believed, was the final keystone. Once it fell, the Soviet Union would unravel, its armies dissolving, its people submitting or scattering eastward into oblivion. The assumptions were clear, repeated endlessly in briefings and directives. The Red Army was inferior, the Soviet system brittle, the war already decided. But Moscow had endured. The city had endured the thunder of artillery from its outskirts, the wail of air raid sirens, the panic of evacuation, and the fear of encirclement. It had endured hunger, cold, and uncertainty. Soldiers had marched from its streets straight into battle. Civilians had dug trenches with bare hands in frozen earth. Factories had produced weapons under bombardment. The capital had not merely survived, it had resisted. That resistance shattered more than a timetable. It shattered a world view. The German army, forged in rapid victory and fueled by ideological certainty, encountered an enemy that refused to conform. The Red Army absorbed disaster after disaster and remained standing. It learned, it adapted, it used time, space, and sacrifice to blunt a force built on speed and decisiveness. The failure to take Moscow marked the first time Nazi Germany had been strategically defeated on land. Not stalled, not delayed, defeated. From that moment forward, the war in the East ceased to be a campaign of conquest and became a struggle for survival. The initiative, once firmly in German hands, began its slow, irreversible shift. For the Soviet Union, the meaning was equally profound. Moscow became the proof that annihilation was not inevitable. The state had bent, but it had not broken. From the ruins of 1941 emerged an army capable of carrying the war westward, step by bloody step. The cost was unimaginable, but the path was now visible. As midnight approached, Morozov watched officers light cigarettes and exchange quiet words, their breath fogging in the cold air. There was no celebration, no illusion that the war was anywhere near over. But there was something else: certainty. A hard, earned belief that the enemy could be beaten. Far from Red Square, the war raged on at Stalingrad, in the Caucasus, across thousands of kilometers of front. Yet every future Soviet advance, every German retreat, carried the imprint of what had happened here. Moscow had refused to fall, and in doing so, it had changed the course of the war. When the bells rang out to greet the new year, their sound rolled across a city that still stood, defiant and alive. In that sound was the echo of a truth the world had come to understand. The Red Army had not been finished in 1941, and Germany's war of conquest had already begun to unravel in the snow before Moscow.